Hi guys. All right, well, we have already talked a little bit about percent of change as we looked at those percent of change tables or charts and looked at how those could help us set up a proportion to find percent of change. And now we're going to continue to talk about percent of change, get some definitions down, and look at how we can set up the proportion without using the chart, because the chart is a great tool. It's something we can absolutely use, but we don't want to have to rely on it every single time. So as we talked about, percent of change indicates how much a quantity increases or decreases with respect to the original amount. And again, we were talking about how talking about change using a percent is a better way to give a full picture of what's happening. So let me try to give you an example of this to help you understand. Okay, so let's say we had school A, and school A had 10 children. It was a very, very small school. And then we have school B, and school B has 100 students. And then we have school C, and they have 1,000 students. So we have different size schools here. And let's say that each school the following year gets 10 more kids. Now, if we just said, well, every school gets 10 more kids, that's a true statement. But obviously 10 kids really impacts these different schools differently, because if your school only has 10 students and you get 10 more students, well, that is a huge increase than if you have 1,000 students and you get 10 more students. So instead, if we talked about this with a percent, we would say that school A increased by 100%, school B increased by 10%, and school C increased by 1%. And you can see how that sort of gives a better picture, because we're talking about how much it increased relative to the original amount. And so that's why using percents can be a better way to talk about change. Now, the difference between percent of increase and percent of decrease is that percent of increase is when the new amount is greater than the original, and percent of decrease is when the new amount is less than the original. And hopefully that's pretty obvious. As we talked about, whenever we talk about percents, we have to use the words increase or decrease, because percents are never negative. So let me try to help you see that. If we go back to our school example, let's go ahead and focus in on school B, where we talked about how school B had 100 students. And if they gained 10 students, we would say that is a 10% increase. If they lost 10 students, that is still a change of 10%, because again, percents are not negative, but now we would say this is a 10% decrease. And so you can see where both these scenarios are different, there's still a change of 10%. That's why we have to say if it increased or decreased. All right, so if you haven't had a chance to get these definitions down, you should pause the video now, write them down, and then press play. So as we look at the proportion that we're going to set up, we talked about how we need to be consistent about what we line up. So we can either compare the change to the original to the change. We could even compare the original to the new, or the new to the original. We would just be left with an extra step there. All right, so let's take a look at our first example. A school had 720 students enrolled last year. This year, 745 students are enrolled. By what percent did the number of students change from last year to this year? All right, so right away, hopefully you see that the enrollment increased. So we know this is going to be a percent increase. And as we set up our proportion here, I could use a table, absolutely, or I can set this up without a table. So I'm going to compare, in this scenario, let's do the change to the original. So my first ratio, I don't know the change percent, and the original percent is always 100. Now the original amount is 720, But on the top here, I need to put the change amount, or as you see up here, the amount of increase or decrease. And again, to get that, I need to do some subtraction. So if I started with 720 and I ended with 745, I can just do some subtraction there to figure out that the students changed by 25. So now I have my proportion. I hope it's obvious to you that you could also set up your proportion with the original on the top. Both your ratios would just be flipped. That's how it typically came out after you used it from the table. But that's the exact same proportion. It's going to give you the exact same answer, so it doesn't matter which way you do it as long as you are consistent. All right, so let's go ahead and use cross products now. I have 720 times x equals 25 times 100. So that's 720x equals 2,500. I'm going to divide each side by 720. And here's where you might want to use your calculator. All right, again, I need to round. So this is x equals 3.47 because the third digit after the decimal point's a 2, so stays as it is. So this is 3.47%. And they wrote out a sentence for you here where they said the number of students increased by about, and you can plug in there 3.47%. You don't have to write a whole sentence like that, but you do have to have the word increase as part of your answer, because as we talked about, a percent is always positive, so we have to use that word. So this enrollment changed by 3.47%, but it was a 3.47% increase. All right, let's take a look at another problem where we don't really have any context for what these numbers are representing. It's not a word problem, but we can still find the percent of, and they tell you right away that it's a decrease here. We can see it goes down from 576 to 216. All right, so I need to set up a proportion. You could either use the chart that we've learned, or you can go straight to seeing that, okay, I'm gonna compare, in this situation, the change to the original. So my first ratio is x over 100. And my original amount is 576, and now I need to do some subtraction to get the change amount. And again, be careful here. Everyone's temptation is just to plug in the numbers that you see, but if you're using the change, then you have to calculate what the change is. In this case, that is 360. All right, so now that we have our proportion set up, we can use cross products. And again, as I've said, there's other ways you can set up this proportion. You could put the original on top and the change on bottom. You could even use the new value as part of your proportion, but then you haven't found the answer. You'd have to do some subtraction at the end to figure out the change percent. Okay, so let's go ahead and use cross products here. We have 576 times x equals 360 times 100. So that's 576x equals 36,000. I'm going to divide each side by 576. Here's where I want to get out my calculator. And I get x equals 62.5. All right, so the percent of decrease is 62.5%. Or you could just say a 62.5% decrease, but as we've talked about, you have to include the word decrease in your answer, and don't forget that percent sign. All right, let's do a few more examples. So it says to identify the percent of change as an increase or decrease, and then find the percent of change. So on all of these, we're figuring out the percent of change. So number one, I can see obviously this is an increase because the original is 20 and the new is 25, so it went up. So as I set up my proportion, I'm going to put the change over the original. That's x over 100 because I don't know the change percent. And the original is 20. I'm going to do some subtraction, 25 minus 20 there, to get that the change is 5. Once I've set up my proportions, then I can now use cross products. So 20 times x equals 5 times 100. I get x equals 25. I need percent, and again, this went up, so this is a 25% increase. All right, let's go on and do number 2. Again, I'm going to compare the change to the original. You can flip that as long as you're consistent. That's x over 100. My original is 75. If I do 75 minus 35 to get the change, that's 40. Again, now I can use cross products. So 75 times x equals 40 times 100. So that's 75x equals 4,000. I'm going to divide each side by 75. And x equals 53.33 because I do need to round. So that would be 53.33%. This one went down, so it is a decrease. So your final answer is 53.33% decrease. All right, why don't you pause the video right now and try number 3 and 4. When you're ready to check your answers, you can press play. All right, so on number 3, you should have gotten a 50% decrease because that one went down in value. And number 4 was a 26% increase. And again, there are other ways to set up those proportions, but no matter which way you set it up, your answers should be the same. All right, we're going to do one more example, and that is number 7. So you can skip 5 and 6 and jump down to 7. Let's do one more word problem. It says, last year, 12,500 people participated in a charity 10K walk. This year, 14,000 people participated in the walk. By what percent did the number of participants change from last year to this year? All right, so I'm going to again put the change on top, the original on the bottom. So I don't know the change percent, and the original percent is always 100. Last year's participants was 12,500, so I know that that is my original, so it goes on the bottom. And then I just can do some subtraction to figure out that it changed by 1,500 people. Again, I just did 14,000 minus 12,500 to get that change amount. So now I can use cross products. So I've got 12,500 times x equals 1,500 times 100. Do some multiplication and then some division. And I get x equals 12, and again this is 12%. And since the participants went up, this is a 12% increase as my answer. All right, so hopefully you see now you can set up the proportions without using those charts. But again, the charts are always a great tool. So if you're stuck on a problem, it's a great way to make sure you have your information organized and your proportions set up correctly. Have a great day.